He almost didn't go downstairs. William Ashford had been awake since 2, which was nothing unusual. Sleep had become an unreliable country since Eleanor died, a place he could visit but never stay in, a territory that kept returning him to its border in the small hours with no explanation and no apology. He had learned to accept the 3 o'clock ceiling the way you accept a recurring injury, not with peace, exactly, but with the specific resignation of a man who has tried everything else. He would lie still. He would not check his phone. He would count his breaths with the mechanical patience of someone who knows that morning always arrives eventually, whether or not you've earned it. But on this particular night, at 12 minutes past 3, he heard something. Not a crash. Not a door. Not the kind of sound that alerts a security system or sends a man reaching for the phone on his nightstand. It was quieter than that, and more disturbing for being quiet. A sound that reached him through the thick walls of the house, the way only certain sounds do, traveling not through plaster and oak, but through something older and less definable. He lay still for a moment and listened, and the sound came again, and he understood then what it was. Someone was crying. He put on his robe and went to the top of the stairs and stood in the dark of the landing. And the house was laid out below him the way it always was at this hour, enormous and silent and full of Eleanor's furniture, which he had not yet been able to change or move or get rid of, which his sister-in-law Genevieve told him at every available opportunity was unhealthy, but which was, in fact, the only reason he had been able to come downstairs at all since the funeral. He stood at the top of the stairs and listened, and the sound was coming from the drawing room. He went down. The drawing room door was open 3 inches. Light came through the gap, not the overhead light, not a lamp, but the blue-white light of a mobile phone screen, which told him before he looked that whoever was in that room was not a burglar. Burglars did not sit in drawing rooms at 3 in the morning with their phone screens illuminating the lower half of their face while they wept without sound, which was what Rose Calloway was doing when William Ashford pushed the door open and stood in the frame and looked at her. She was sitting on the floor beside the sofa, her back against the seat cushion, her knees drawn up, holding the phone with both hands the way you hold something that is the only warm thing in a cold room. She had not heard him come in. She was speaking, very quietly, barely above a whisper, and he stood in the doorway for 3 full seconds before she became aware of him, which was 3 seconds longer than he had any business standing there. But he could not move because of what he had just heard her say. She had said, "I'm right here, baby. Mama's right here. You don't have to be frightened. Just listen to my voice." Rose Calloway looked up and saw him, and in one movement she was standing, the phone at her side, her posture corrected, with a speed that told him she had been caught before, in moments she had not intended to share and had learned to reassemble herself without hesitation. Her face was wet. She did not wipe it. She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has decided that there is no version of this moment that requires her to be ashamed of it. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "I'm sorry. I'll go upstairs." "Stay where you are," he said. He said it more sharply than he intended, which was a habit he had developed recently without realizing it, a sharpness that had nothing to do with the person it was directed at, and everything to do with the person it came from. He softened it. "Please. Stay." She stayed. She stood beside the sofa in the blue dark of the drawing room, holding her phone, and he sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, because his legs had done something uncertain on the way down the stairs, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. "Who were you talking to?" he said. He knew it was not his right to ask. He asked anyway. She looked at him for a moment, measuring something. Not him, he understood, but the decision. Then she said, "My daughter. Her name is Clara. She's 8. She has nights when she can't sleep, and she's frightened. and I found that if I stay on the line and talk to her, she can settle. It usually takes about 20 minutes. She paused. I didn't think anyone would hear me. I'm sorry if I disturbed you. Where is she? He said. St. Edmunds, she said. The Children's Care Facility. On Mercer Street. He knew St. Edmunds. He had driven past it 100 times. He had not known what it was until Eleanor's illness had made him look at the names of buildings differently, the way grief rearranges your attention, sharpening it towards certain signs as though the world is trying to prepare you for a conversation you are not yet ready to have. She's been there for 5 months, Rose said, without him asking. She has a tumor. They're managing the pain. Mostly, she has good days. She said this last sentence in the voice of someone who has learned to believe it and not believe it at the same time, which is the only way a person in that position can function at all. William Ashford sat in his chair and looked at the cold fireplace and said nothing for a moment, because there was nothing to say that was adequate, and he had learned with Eleanor that inadequate things said in the wrong moment can calcify into the wrong shape and become permanent. So he said nothing, and Rose did not seem to require anything from the silence. The trouble began 3 days later. Genevieve arrived on a Tuesday, the way she always did, without prior arrangement, with luggage, with opinions. She was Eleanor's sister, which was the reason William had always tolerated her presence in his house, and she was constitutionally incapable of entering any room without immediately assessing its contents and finding them wanting. She walked through the drawing room on her first afternoon, running a finger along the mantelpiece in a gesture that was framed as checking for dust, but was in fact checking for authority, and she stopped at the side table beneath the east window and said, with a precision that William recognized immediately as prepared, "William, where is your father's watch?" He turned. The side table held a lamp, a small decorative bowl, and a framed photograph of his parents at the house in 1987. The shallow tray beside the bowl, the tray where the watch always sat, the gold pocket watch that had belonged to his father and his father's father, which had not left that table in 11 years, was empty. He was certain it had been there that morning. Genevieve's eyes moved to him with the expression of someone performing concern while experiencing something considerably more useful. "I noticed it was missing yesterday, actually," she said. "I didn't want to alarm you, but given that it's been 2 days now, I thought it needed to be said." She paused. "You know, I don't like to point fingers, but I did see Rose in this room on Sunday evening, alone, longer than she needed to be, I thought." He said nothing. He was very good at saying nothing when Genevieve was in a room. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said, in the tone of a person suggesting something. "I simply think it would be prudent to have a conversation before you make assumptions in either direction." She touched the empty tray with one finger. "It was your father's, William. It can't be replaced." The conversation he had with Rose that afternoon was one he would not remember with any pride. He called her into the study, not the kitchen, not the hallway, but the study, which was the most formal room in the house, and which communicated, without him having to say it, that this was not an ordinary exchange. He told her the watch was missing. He told her she had been seen in the drawing room. He watched her face while he said these things. She did not flinch. She did not color. She looked at him with that same quality of stillness she had shown at 3 a.m. Not the stillness of guilt, which is a particular kind of stillness, coiled and careful, but the stillness of a person who has already understood what is happening and has made a decision about how to meet it. "I was in the drawing room on Sunday evening," she said. "Yes, I was straightening the cushions on the sofa. When I moved the end cushion, the large one, on the left side, the watch was underneath it. I assumed it had fallen there. I placed it back in the tray, and I left the room." He looked at her. "I didn't take it," she said. "And I'd like to think that 6 years was enough time for you to know that, Miss Ashford. But if it isn't, I understand. You have to be sure." She met his eyes directly. "I wasn't stealing from you, Mr. Ashford. I was talking to my daughter. She has nights where she's frightened, and I'm not there. That's all I've ever been guilty of in this house." He said, "I'll need to look into this further before, of course," she said. And she left the room. That evening, Genevieve told him she thought he should call a security firm. A professional assessment of the staff situation, she said. She knew a company. She happened to have a card. She was only thinking of him, she said. Of the house. Of Eleanor's memory. Of what Eleanor would have wanted, which was a phrase Genevieve had been deploying since the funeral with the specific frequency of someone who has noticed it tends to work. William Ashford sat in the drawing room after Genevieve had gone to her room and the house had settled into its nighttime self. And he looked at the empty tray beside the lamp, and he thought about what Rose had said. About the cushion. He leaned forward and lifted the end cushion from the sofa, the large one, on the left side, exactly as she had described, and looked underneath it. There was nothing there. Of course there was nothing there. She had described placing the watch back in the tray on Sunday. He wasn't looking for the watch. He was looking for the specific quality of truth in a small detail, the kind of detail that a person constructing a lie would not have thought to make so particular. Anyone inventing a story says, "I found it and put it back." Only someone telling the truth says, "I moved the left cushion and it was underneath." He replaced the cushion. He sat back. He thought about Genevieve, who had known the watch was missing since the day before she mentioned it, and who had a card for a security company ready in her pocket, and who had stood at that mantelpiece with her finger running along the dust on the day she arrived, and looked at this house as though she were calculating something that had not yet been agreed to. Eleanor had never quite trusted her sister. He had always assumed this was the reflexive wariness of an older sibling. He was no longer assuming that. He went to his study, and he pulled up on his computer the camera logs for the drawing room. The house had a camera system, discreet, installed after a break-in 3 years ago. 2 small lenses set into the cornicing on either side of the mantelpiece, and he had the password, but had never once used it, because until now there had been nothing to look for, and he had found, in the months since Eleanor, that he did not particularly want a recording of empty rooms going dark at the end of each day. He searched for Sunday evening. He entered the timestamp range. The system was old and loaded slowly, the way things do when they have not been asked to perform in a long time. He found what he was looking for in 12 minutes. At 6:47, Rose Calloway entered the drawing room with a cloth and moved through it with the steady, unhurried pace of someone who has cleaned the same room enough times that the order of surfaces is automatic. She reached the sofa. She straightened the cushions in sequence. She lifted the end cushion. She stopped. She looked at what was beneath it. The watch, clearly visible on the recording, lying face up on the fabric where it had fallen. She picked it up. She examined it for no more than 3 seconds. She walked to the side table and placed it in the tray. She left the room. At 7:15, Genevieve entered the drawing room. She crossed directly, not wandering, not tidying, directly to the side table. She picked up the watch. She looked at it. She slipped it into the pocket of her cardigan. She left the room. He watched this recording 3 times. The 3rd time, he paused it on the frame where Genevieve's hand closed around the watch, and he sat in the dark of his study. And he understood with a clarity that felt almost physical, like cold water, like a lamp switched on in a room that had been dark long enough that the light was disorienting. Exactly what had happened, and why, and for how long someone had been treating his house, and his grief, and his trust as materials to be worked with. He called his solicitor that evening, He did not call Genevieve. The following morning, he asked Genevieve to come to the drawing room. He asked Rose to come to the drawing room. He asked Mrs. Holt, who had been the household manager for 19 years, and who had said nothing throughout all of this, but whose face during the preceding days had contained multitudes, to be present as a witness, which she agreed to with the quiet relief of someone who has been waiting to be asked. The drawing room had 3 large windows on the south wall, and the morning light came in at an angle that illuminated everything honestly, which seemed appropriate. Genevieve arrived first and positioned herself beside the fireplace, with the air of someone who has already decided how this scene ends. Rose arrived 30 seconds later, came through the door, saw the configuration of the room, and understood it immediately. He could see her understand it. The small adjustment of her posture, the steadiness that settled over her like something she was putting on for the last time. He placed the laptop on the table, and he played the recording. Genevieve watched it. He watched her watch it. She was a woman who had maintained a particular story about herself for a long time, and watching a story end is a specific kind of experience that people handle in very different ways. Some people collapse. Some people redirect. Some people look for the seam in the wall where the argument might still be threaded through. Genevieve chose redirection. She began to speak, something about the angle of the camera, about how footage could be misinterpreted, about how she had simply been examining the watch because she had been worried about its security, about how everything she had done had been out of concern for William's well-being and the integrity of Eleanor's estate, which she had worked very hard to protect, and which she felt she deserved some credit for. Frankly, given the energy she had invested, he said. Don't. Quietly, with a finality that closed the room. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds. It felt considerably longer. Mrs. Holt, by the window, pressed her lips together and looked at the floor in the way of someone exercising very great restraint. He said, "The watch has been returned. My solicitor has the recording. You will leave this house today. Whatever arrangements need to be made about Eleanor's estate can be made through the appropriate legal process, which is where they should have been made from the beginning, and where they will be made from now on." He looked at her steadily. "You used her name to do this. That is the thing I will not forget." Genevieve left. She did not say anything on her way out that was worth repeating, and so it will not be repeated here. He turned to Rose. She was standing at the same distance she always stood, with the same quality of attention, which was the quality of someone who is present, in the full sense of the word, not managing the moment, not calculating the response, but simply there, inhabiting it completely. He said, "I owe you an apology that should have been offered before this morning." "Yes," she said, "you do." He had not expected agreement. He found it clarifying. "I'm sorry," he said. "I was given a story, and I gave it too much room." "Grief does that," she said. Not unkindly, not as an excuse. He understood she was not offering him an excuse, but as a fact about the condition, stated by someone who knew it from the inside and was willing to acknowledge it in someone else. It narrows what you can see. You were looking for things to be simpler than they were. She paused. So was I, if I'm honest. I should have told you about Clara sooner. I kept thinking it was mine to carry. It's not, he said. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. I'm learning that. He visited St. Edmund's on a Thursday. He told Rose he was going, and she said nothing for a moment. The kind of nothing that is not absence but consideration, weighing something he could not see. And then she said, if it was all the same to him, she would prefer to come with him. And he said it was all the same to him. And they went together in his car through the city, and he did not try to fill the drive with conversation, because she was looking out the window at the streets in the way that people do when they are counting down to something they have been counting down to all day and do not want. Interrupted. St. Edmunds was a low brick building set back from the road, with a garden along the front that someone had planted with bulbs that were just beginning to push through. The reception area had the specific smell of all care buildings, antiseptic and something floral underneath. Someone's determined effort to make a medical space feel like a room where a person might choose to be. Rose walked through it the way she walked through everything, steadily, without hurry, knowing the way. He followed her down a corridor to a room at the end where the window looked out on the garden, and she knocked twice and opened the door. Clara had her mother's stillness and her mother's eyes, and none of her mother's reticence, which is the great privilege of being 8 years old and too sick to waste time on indirection. She looked at William from her bed, with the frank assessment of a child deciding whether a person is worth her attention, and she said, "Mama said you have a big house. Is it lonely?" He sat in the plastic chair beside her bed and thought about this, with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," he said. "It's been very lonely. Mama's lonely at nighttime," Clara said. "That's why I call her, so she's not alone." She considered him. "You could call someone too, you know. You don't have to just be lonely." He looked at Rose over the child's head. Rose was looking at her daughter with an expression that contained so much pride and grief and exhaustion and love, layered in that specific way that only parents of sick children wear, that he had to look away. "No," he said, "you don't." What happened in the months that followed was decided in rooms and through documents, and with the deliberate, patient work of people who believe that the right structures, properly built, can outlast the circumstances that created them. His solicitor and the board of the Eleanor Ashford Foundation, which had been established after her death to support causes she had cared about, and which had not yet found its specific purpose, met twice. Rose was asked to attend the second meeting, which she did, in the same coat, with the same quality of attention. The Eleanor Ashford and Clara Calloway Children's Palliative Care Wing was funded and named at a ceremony in the spring, at St. Edmunds, in a room full of staff, who had cared for Clara and other children like her through nights that asked things of them that could not be captured in any job description. William had insisted on a small ceremony, not a gala, not a fundraising event with a guest list designed to impress, but the actual people, the nurses from the overnight shift, the family liaison workers, the cleaning staff who stripped and reset the rooms between families, the administrator who had once told Rose over the phone at 2 in the morning that the fund would cover the shortfall, and then waited on the line until she stopped shaking. These people sat in plastic chairs in the common room and ate sandwiches from a table along the wall and talked to each other without any particular ceremony, which was exactly right. The wing would provide private rooms with proper beds for parents who needed to stay through the night without sleeping in chairs, and a 24-hour family liaison service, and a fund, open-ended, capitalized from the Eleanor Ashford Foundation's endowment, that covered care for families whose insurance fell short, which was a greater number of families than most people outside that building understood or wanted to. Clara's name was on the dedication plaque beside Eleanor's. She saw it on the day of the ceremony and stood in front of it for a long time, reading her own name in bronze letters with the particular expression of a child encountering something real for the first time. And then she looked up at her mother and said, "It's real." "It's real," Rose said. "Does that mean I'm important?" Rose crouched down so they were level. "It means you were always important," she said. "This is just so the wall knows, too." William Ashford stood nearby and looked at the two of them, and he thought about the drawing room at 3 in the morning, and the way Rose had said the word baby into the phone, with her knees drawn up, and the blue light of the screen on her face, and how he had almost not gone downstairs. how close the whole thing had come to going the other way. How many mornings he had stood at the top of those stairs and decided the sound was nothing and gone back to bed. He was glad, with a completeness that surprised him, that on this particular night he had been wrong. He walked back through the corridor of the new wing, past the rooms with their proper beds and their reading lights, and their small allowances for the dignity of families in impossible situations. And as he passed the end of the hallway, he noticed the curtain in the family room at the far corner. A room with its window fully closed against the spring chill. Not a gap in the frame, not a vent moving. Shift. Just once. The heavy curtain fabric lifted slightly at its hem and then settled, as though something had passed through the room without stopping and was satisfied with what it found. He stood in the corridor for a moment. He did not mention it to anyone. Some things do not need to be spoken to be received. If you have ever sat in a hospital corridor at 3 a.m, holding a phone that is the only thread between you and someone you love, then you know the particular quality of that silence. You know how the building changes at that hour, how the sound of footsteps becomes something you hold your breath for, and how the light from a phone screen is both the smallest and the largest thing in the room. You know what it costs to keep your voice steady for someone who needs to hear it steady. And if you know all of that, then you know what Rose Calloway was doing in that drawing room. And you know also that the only thing remarkable about it is not that she did it. Of course she did it. What else could she have done? But that someone finally stopped at the right door and listened, and then was honest enough to understand what he heard. Grief, when it is allowed to remain only grief, when it is not weaponized, not manipulated, not turned into a story by someone who needs it to point in a particular direction, has a strange property. It makes you porous. It opens the places in you that were sealed by ordinary life, and through those gaps, if you are paying attention, you can receive what you could not receive before. William Ashford had been walking through his house for 8 months, sealed by a loss so total that he had stopped being able to distinguish between the people who were trying to reach him and the people who were using the distance to their advantage. He had needed something to crack him open. He had needed to go downstairs. Clara improved through the summer. Not entirely. The mountain that remained was still a mountain, and no amount of naming things after people changes the biology of what lives in a child's body. But the nights became easier with a proper bed to sleep in, and a family liaison who answered the phone at 2 a.m. without sighing. And Rose was there more often, which is the thing that the medicine and the fund and the named wing all existed to make possible. The logistics of love are less romantic than its declarations, but they are what love actually runs on, and the wing understood this, which was perhaps the most important thing about it. On an evening in October, William sat at the kitchen table in a house that no longer felt quite as enormous because the people in it had shifted into a configuration that had more warmth than the one before. Mrs. Holt was in the next room. Clara was in a chair by the window with a book she was mostly using as a prop while she watched the garden. Rose was making tea with the particular efficiency of someone in a kitchen she knows well enough to move through without looking. He said, "I have a question," she said. "You're allowed one." He almost smiled. "What did she say to you that night, when you were on the phone and I was in the doorway? What did she say that made you cry like that?" Rose was quiet for a moment, her back to him, her hands on the counter. Then she said, "Mama, if I fall asleep and don't wake up, will you still talk to me?" The kitchen was very quiet. "And what did you say?" he said. "I told her that I would talk to her every single day," she said, "that she would never have to listen very hard, because I would never be very far." She turned around. Her eyes were steady. "And then I told her a story until she fell asleep. That's what I do. I tell her stories. It takes about 20 minutes. He looked at her. He looked at Clara by the window, who had abandoned the pretense of reading and was watching the garden with her chin on her hand and her face illuminated by the last of the October light, which was the color of something very beautiful and very brief. "That's what you were doing," he said, "when I found you." "That's all I've ever been doing," she said. Some houses hold their losses like a held breath. Every room sealed, every chair in the place it was last occupied by someone who is gone, every curtain drawn against the fact of mourning. And some houses, slowly, by the work of ordinary life and the presence of people who carry their grief without requiring it to be invisible. Learn to breathe again, not to forget, not to replace, to breathe. It is a different thing entirely, and it takes longer than anyone tells you, and it cannot be planned or decided or funded into existence. It can only be permitted. Allowed. Welcome through the door at 3 a.m. when you hear something in the dark and you go downstairs, and you listen, and you understand that the sound you heard was not an intrusion, but an invitation to put down the story you had been carrying about who was in your house and why, and to pick up instead the true one, which was always kinder, and always more complicated, and always, in the end, the only one worth telling. He stood in the kitchen that October evening, and he looked at Clara by the window, and he thought about all the mornings he had stood at the top of the stairs and decided the sound was nothing and gone back to bed. He had told himself, on those mornings, that it was not his place to intrude, that the people who worked in his house were entitled to their private lives and private hours, that a good employer maintained a respectful distance. He had told himself this with some conviction, and it was not entirely wrong. But there is a version of respectful distance that is really just the preference for not being required to respond, and he had been living in that version for longer than he wanted to admit. The watch was back on the side table. He had put it there himself when Genevieve's solicitor returned it 2 days after she left. He had held it in his hands for a moment before setting it down. The weight of it, the specific warmth of old gold, the way the case opened with a pressure he had known since he was 7 years old, and his father had first shown him the mechanism. His father's hands on the case, then his. He had set it back in its place in the tray and left it there, and he had not looked at it again until this evening, when Clara had noticed it from across the room and asked what it was, and he had taken it to her and opened it and shown her the mechanism, and she had watched with the total attention of a child encountering something old and precise and still working perfectly, and she had said, very seriously, "Things last longer than people think they will, don't they?" He had looked at her. "Yes," he said, "they do."